Tonight's year, Elul Nishmat Avi Marido Ber Ber Nuven Halevi Imi Marati Rachel Bar Harav Michael. This Shabbos we have the privilege of reading parshat Ki Tavo, which has a lot of interesting features in it. Number of mitzvot. Tonight we're going to focus on chapter Chav Zayin, which talks about some mitzvot that are not counted in the 613, primarily because they are mitzvot that are one-time mitzvot only, basically. These are specific series of mitzvot that are commanded for Am Yisrael to fulfill once they enter Eretz Yisrael. And we're going to try to see how these mitzvot were actually fulfilled by Am Yisrael when they entered Eretz Yisrael after the 40 years in the Midbar. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight. Even though, as I said, lots of other things in the parsha that we could be focusing on. We're going to focus on Parak Chav Zayin, chapter 27. So I'm going to start, as you see, with the beginning of Parak Chav Zayin. It says, Vaytzav Moshe v'ziknei Yisrael. Now remember, Moshe is in the last days, last month of his life. He is giving Am Yisrael lots of chizuk. We've just been through 3 parshiot full of mitzvot. And now we are basically, Moshe is giving basically what I'll call the final instructions for entering Eretz Yisrael and what we are to do upon that entry. So that's what this chapter focuses on. Moshe and the elders command the people as follows. I want you to observe all the mitzvot that I'm commanding you today. And again, here are the specifics. It should come to pass on the day that you actually cross the Jordan to the land that Hashem is giving you. You should establish for yourself large stones and plaster them with plaster. And then you should write upon them, it called Divrei Torah Hazot, all the words of this Torah bi'avrecha when you cross over. Leman, in order that Asher Tavo la'aretz Asher Hashem lokecha noten lach, that you should come into the land that Hashem is giving you. Eretz zavat chalav v'dvash, a land flowing with milk and honey. Kasher diber Hashem Elokei avotecha lach, as Hashem, the God of your ancestors, has spoken to you. So here in verses 2 and 3, we seem to have a commandment of establishing some type of stones, plastering them, and writing the words of the Torah on these. Seems to be commandment number 1. Commandment number 2, or perhaps a further explanation of commandment number 1. It should come to pass when you cross over the Jordan. Takimu et havonim ha'ela. You should establish these stones. That I'm commanding you hayom today. Where should you establish them? Bahar Eval, on Mount Eval. V'sadetotam basid. Plaster them with plaster. By the way, we've seen that verse above. Also, that verse seems to be repeated here and repeated above here, where it says v'sadetotam basid. Also, the same exact wording. That's what leads many of the Parshanim to tell us that we're talking about the same exact sets of stones. We're going to see some of the Parshanim may not necessarily agree with that. Uvanita sham mizbeach, and you should build there, again, presumably on Har Eval, next to Har Eval, a mizbeach, an altar, l'Hashem Elokecha, to Hashem, mizbach avanim, it should be an altar made of stones, lo tanif aleim barzel. The stones with which the altar is constructed are not to be shaped in any way with any iron implement. We have, by the way, the same halacha with any stone mizbeach that is built. Similarly, back in Sefer Shmot, we had the same mitzvah. Avanim shleimot tivneh, they should be built with complete stones at mizbach Hashem Elokecha, valita alav olot, and you should offer upon it burnt offerings l'Hashem Elokecha. Similarly, additionally, v'zavakta shlamim v'chalta sham, you should bring peace offerings and eat them there. V'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, and you should rejoice before Hashem. And then v'chatavta ha'avanim, you should write on these stones at kol divrei Torah hazot, all the words of this Torah, be'er heitev, thoroughly explained. So we see again two seemingly possibly complementary descriptions of the same thing, or perhaps two different descriptions of two different things that we are commanded to do. And by the way, finally, we are commanded by Tzav Moshe at Ha'am Bayom HaHulemor. Moshe commands the people on that day, saying as following: Eila yamdu levarechet amal har grizim bi'avrachem et hayardain. When you cross over the Jordan, the following tribes should stand for the blessing that will be recited over the people. They will bless. People will be blessed by. They will stand. Some will stand on har grizim. When you cross the Jordan, these tribes, 6 tribes on Har Grizim, are Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Yosef, and Binyamin. The Ela Yamdu Al Haklala Bahar Eval, and the following will stand on Har Eval, Mount Eval, which is exactly opposite, on the opposite of the end of the valley from Har Grizim. And they will stand Al Haklala, they will stand and testify to the curse. Ruvain, Gad, V'Asher, Rizul, and Dan, and Naphtali. And then we are told this whole ceremony, then we are given an entire ceremony where the Leviim are to speak in a loud voice and recite a whole series of blessings and curses that Am Yisrael are all to answer Amen for those on both sides of the 2 mountains. So we have seemingly 3 different or possibly 2 different commands here. One is the day they cross the Jordan, they're supposed to establish these stones. Perhaps there's a second commandment or a second set of stones that are to be established at Har Eval after they've crossed the Jordan. And then after they do that, they are supposed to recite all of these passages. Now we're going to go to Sefer Yoshua and see what happened when the Jews crossed over into Eretz Yisrael. So in the chapter 3, we read about the preparations for crossing over the Yarden, and in chapter 4, we find that Am Yisrael has passed over the Yarden. We're now in Yoshua chapter 4, and when all of the people, all of Am Yisrael, have completed crossing the Jordan under Yoshua, Vayomer Hashem el Yoshua lemor, Hashem commands Yoshua with the following. Select for yourself from the people 12 people. One individual from each of the 12 tribes is selected. And they are commanded as follows. Raise up for yourself from inside the river. Again, remember, the river has now split, just like the splitting of the sea. The water is stopped flowing. Am Yisrael has crossed over the Yarden. The people have crossed. The Aron is now waiting to complete the crossing, but the water has not started flowing yet. So Hashem tells Yoshua to take 12 people and take 12 stones. From where the Kohanim who are carrying the Aron are standing. Prepare 12 stones. Take these 12 stones with you. And allow them, bring them to rest. At the resting place, or literally Malone is an inn, where you are going to stop and camp tonight. Wherever you camp that night, the first night after they've crossed the Jordan, that is where these 12 stones that they've lifted up from the riverbed of the Jordan are to be established. That's what Hashem tells Yoshua. Yoshua calls these 12 people, by the way, he's already prepared these 12 people. Yoshua tells these 12 men, he tells them, Hashem passed before the ark, El Toch HaYarden, to the middle of the Jordan. And each person should raise a stone. I don't know, we always translate stone. I'm thinking of a huge boulder here that has to be carried on your shoulder, whatever the maximum weight a person can carry on his shoulder is. So each of you, there are 12 of you, one from each tribe. We got to take 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of Israel. Leman, why do we need these 12 stones? Yoshua tells them, that we should have this sign amongst you in your midst. The following sign: Ki ish alun b'nechem machar lemor. When your children will ask in the future, they will ask the following: okay, I see this. Every time I come to this place on the near the Jordan River, I see these 12 stones. What are they all about? What is this? In other words, when you go on a tour of this place, you're going to ask the guide what these 12 stones are all about. That's what Yeshua is telling the people, right? V'amartem lohem, and you will answer your children, Asher nichretu meimei hayardein mipnei Aaron brit Hashem b'yavro b'yardein nichretu mei hayardein, that the waters of the Jordan River were cut when the ark of Hashem passed through the Jordan. The waters were split. These stones should be a memorial to Livnei Yisrael ad olam. This is an eternal memorial to Am Yisrael that the waters of the Jordan split. This is a very critical component of this whole procedure. The whole reason we have this is as an ongoing memorial that this took place. They did as Yeshua commanded, and they took 12 stones. They brought them with them to the encampment, and they rested there. Now Yeshua also took 12 stones and placed them in the middle of the Jordan. Underneath the feet of the Kohanim. So in addition to the fact that they took 12 stones from the riverbed, 12 boulders or whatever, and established them on dry land, they presumably took 12 stones from different stones from dry land and established them as a monument in the middle of the river, so that there were two noticeable signs that Am Yisrael had crossed the river. And then the Kohanim, who were carrying Toch Yarden, the Kohanim stood in the middle of the Yarden, until all this had been completed. According to all that Moshe had commanded Yeshua, and the people hurried across to cross the Jordan. And then it says, when they all finished crossing, then Yeshua tells them all these things. But then I wanted to find. Then we skip to Chazachaf. These 12 stones that were lifted and raised, taken from the riverbed. Hakim Yoshua ba Gilgal, Yoshua established in Gilgal, which was the place they camped that first night. And again, what does he tell them? He says, when the children will ask you what these are all about, you'll tell them, Am Yisrael crossed the river on dry land, just like Hashem did to the Yam Suf when you were leaving Egypt, in order, Lamandat Kol Amei Haaretz et Yad Hashem Haki Chazakahi, in order that everyone should know that the hand of Hashem is strong, Laman Yoraitem et Hashem Lokechem Kol Yamim, and the whole purpose of these monuments is that we, Am Yisrael, should understand and be in awe of Hashem as long as we are in Eretz Yisrael. Key message here of this whole ceremony of taking the 12 stones out of the river, establishing them as a monument where they camped that first night, all of that is so that we will never forget that when we are in Eretz Yisrael, we are here by the grace of Hashem, to fulfill Hashem's Torah and to establish a society based on the laws of Hashem's Torah. That's the key component here that Yeshua wants to impress upon the people through these stones. Now, you'll notice here, no discussion of writing anything, no discussion of any ceremony of blessing and curses. Does not happen in Perek Daled. We go now to Yeshua. We now have, by the way, Perek Hey, Vav, talk about the conquest of Yericho. Perek Zayin talks about the fact that Achan took from the spoils, and then we go to fight against Ai, and the first battle against Ai we lose, the second battle against Ai is successful. And now we pick up the story in the middle. We've just finished the conquest of Ai after we conquered Jericho. We're now toward the end of chapter 8 in Yoshua. So we've gone from chapter 4, where we talked about crossing the Yarden, to chapter 8 after we've already fought a couple of battles, conquered a couple of cities, and now we're going to continue with the story. Suddenly, Yoshua now at this point decides to build an altar L'Hashem Elokei Israel. Where? The Hareval. At Hareval. We've heard that place before. Where? In our parsha, where Hashem tells him to build a Mizbeach on Hareval, or near Hareval, whatever. Kasher Tziva. And what does Yoshua say? What does it say when Yoshua builds this Mizbeach? Kasher Tziva, Moshe, Eved Hashem et Bnei Israel. Like Moshe has commanded the children of Israel, Kakatuv b'Sefer Torah Moshe, as is written in the story of Moshe. Can I ask everybody to please mute? There's a lot of background noise. I don't know where it's coming from, but if we can ask everybody to please mute. Thank you. Just like Yoshua built this altar, just as Moshe had commanded Am Yisrael in the Torah, which we read about above, which we're going to read in this week's parsha. What is it? Mizbach Avanim Shleimot, an altar of full stones. Asher lo henif aleim barzel, were never shaped with iron. Vayalu alav olot l'Hashem vayizbechu shlamim, and they did exactly as our parsha tells us. They brought olot, they brought shlamim. Now, and now they wrote on the stones at Mishnah Torah Moshe, the repetition of the Torah of Moshe, Asher Katav Lifnei Bnei Israel. Now, there's a difference of opinion as to exactly what was written, but it seems from here that what do we call Mishnah Torah is, of course, Sefer Dvarim, or perhaps only the mitzvot of Sefer Dvarim, but something was written on these stones. V'chol Yisrael, Uzikenav, Vishot Ruim, Vishov Tav, Omdim Mizeh Umizel Aaron, and all of Israel, and the elders, and the police officers, and the judges were all standing on any side around the ark, Neged HaKohanim HaLeviyim, opposite the Kohanim and the Leviim who were carrying the ark, Nosei Aaron B'Yid Hashem, Kager, Ka'ezrach, whether they were a convert or a regular citizen. Chetzio el mul har grizim, half of them were facing har grizim. Chetzio mul hareval, half of them were facing hareval. Kasher tzivash Moshe eved Hashem levarechet ha'am Yisrael barishona, just like Moshe commanded through that they are to be blessed when they enter Eretz Yisrael. The acharei kain, and after that, karad kol divrei Torah bracha v'aklala. They read all the words of the Torah, the bracha and the klala, k'chol hakatuv b'sefer Torah, according to all that is written in the Sefer Torah that we have. So again, we see here in chapter 8, suddenly we get to carrying out the building of the altar, the writing on the stones, and the blessings and the curses that are recited in our parsha. Notice here we're in chapter 8, seemingly not right after they crossed the Yarden. Now, it concludes with the following word: Lo hayad davar mikol asher tziva Moshe. There was nothing that from all of the words that Moshe had commanded, asher lo kara Yoshua neged kol kal Yisrael v'anoshim v'yatav v'ger olech b'kirbam. That Yoshua read all that Moshe had commanded in front of all of the congregation of Am Yisrael, the women, the children, and everybody was included. Okay, so again, if I were to look at what happens in chapter 8, it seems that this is not happening at the same time that what we read in chapter 4 happens. There seems to be a number of things that happen in between. So now we go, of course, to our parshanim. Rashi. Rashi says the following. Let's skip. Let's skip this here. Okay, no. Rashi says the following. Firstly, in chapter 4 in Yoshua says the following. Okay, you have to take these stones with you. Kimitzvat Moshe, like Moshe commanded, livnot lahem mizbeach b'hareval, that the 12 stones that they took from the Jordan River were carried with them to Hareval. And what did they do with them when they got to Harivol? They built an altar with them. Torah. And they also wrote all the words of the Torah. Ubo bayom. Now Rashi says, even though that is not recorded until chapter 8, Rashi says that what happens in chapter 8 happened at the same time as chapter 4. Ubo bayom, the exact same day that they crossed the Jordan, they took those stones to Harivol, they built the Mizbeach, they wrote on the stones, and and then they took the whole thing back apart, and they came and encamped at Gilgal. So they had a very, very busy first day in Eretz Yisrael. You thought your first day was busy dealing with all the paperwork. Here's what they had to do. They crossed the Jordan in the morning. They went all the way they took the 12 stones out of the river. They went all the way to Harivol, which, by the way, for those of you who don't know, Harivol and Har Grizim are right outside Shechem. I looked on my Google Maps this morning. We're talking about a 30-mile march, not very simple. And they did the whole ceremony at Harivol and Har Grizim that we read about, and then they dismantled the altar, dismantled the stones, and took them all back toward the Jordan River to Gilgal, where they met and marched another 30-mile hike backwards, all in the same day. Okay? Okay, so that's Rashi's perspective. And Rashi goes through the same exact thing in Perek Chet. He says very clearly, Parsha za ketuva mukdam umuchar shemiyom shavru et hayarden osachein. That this chapter 8 is out of place. It's not written in chronological order because this all happened on the day they crossed the Jordan River. Okay? All right, we're going to skip the rest of Rashi because basically he just continues that. And Radak basically says the exact same thing. Az kish'avru Yisrael et hayarden. That even though it says us here in chapter 8, it means back in chapter 4 when they crossed the Jordan. Ve'ein mukdam u'mi'uchar ba'torah. In words of the Torah, we cannot say just because something appears in a chapter before something else, it precedes it chronologically. The Torah is not a history book, not written in chronological order. Because Radak says that's exactly what is written in the Torah. As we saw, all of these things are all say when you cross the Jordan. Then you have to have Akimot Chavanim Gidolot, V'sato Sambasid, and here's Shamizbeach. So Radak is saying that the two passages talking about stones are talking about the same event. And it all happened, even though we read about it in chapter 8 in Yeshua, it all happened really at the same time that chapter 4 happened. The Az Hutru Abamot Kalzman Sheba. You'll go, okay, so that's the, and now I'm going to go and skip all the rest of Radak. And we're going to go directly to Abarbanel, who has lots of questions with the classic interpretation. And by the way, Rashi doesn't make this up. Radak doesn't make this up. The Gemara in Sota seems to imply the same thing, that all of this happened on one day. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying it happened on one day. It just meant that they did a lot of traveling. And again, we know that Am Yisrael was able, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's help, to travel great distances in very short periods of time and to accomplish miraculous things in very short periods of time. However, again, clearly, if we are to go with the Gemara's interpretation that all of this happened on the day they crossed the Yarden, there's quite a bit of either hidden or open miracles that are happening here that are not directly stated in the verse in terms of travel time, in terms of other things. We're going to see what Abarbanel has to say about this. So, okay. All right, let's go to the question. So first, Abarbanel, as usually he does when he comments on a section in Tanakh, he starts with all of the questions that he's going to try to deal with in his commentary. So he starts with the following questions. Question number 1. Why does Yoshua wait until chapter 8 to build this altar? Torah Amra, if the Torah's command is Vayabi Avrachem and Hayarden, when you cross the Jordan, and in another place in our parish it says Vayabi Yom Asher Tavrat Hayarden, on the day that you cross the Jordan, Ve'ech Azav Ha'inyan Arata. Why did he wait until now, after he's already finished conquering Yericho, conquering Hai? Why now does he suddenly revert and do all of these things? Is what's going on here? Why did he wait so long? The im nemar kedivrei Chazal. If we're going to say like the Gemara wants to say, which is exactly the opinion we brought down in Rashi and Radak, shayezeh bayom avrom et hayarden. If chapter 8 in Yoshua happens on the same day that chapter 4 happens, Yikshem Ma'od, it's a very, very question. I don't understand. Lama nirtav b'chan. Acharei melchemet ha'ayu kvishat Yericho haya shekodem elav. If it is before these two battles that we read about in chapters 5, 6, 7, and the first half of chapter 8, or first 2/3 of chapter 8, why is it written here suddenly? We suddenly now, oh, by the way, we forgot to tell you all the things that happened in chapter 4. That doesn't make sense to Barbanel. Number 2. If we go back to our parsha, we find that there are 3 different commandments. Number 1, so we have 3 things though. He has to build a mizbeach, he has to plaster the stones and write on the stones the words of the Torah. And when we read this story in chapter 8, we had no mention of the plastering. We just mentioned they wrote on the stones, but it doesn't say anything about they plastered the stones. So there's something from the commandment that's missing. The plastering of the stones seems to be missing in the story, according to Barbanel. Question number 3. Moshe commands that the establishment of the stones, these permanent stones that you're supposed to write on the Torah on, and the altar are supposed to be in the same location. According to Chazal, lo hayakein. According to the Gemara in Sota and Rashi's and Radak's opinion, Ki Yoshua bana mizbeach b'rishona b'Hareval. The mizbeach was built on Hareval. V'akamat havadim tzivach hakach b'Gilgal. But the stones are established in Gilgal, as we read in chapter 4. So it seems to be that if Moshe tells him he's got to put it in the same place, and he puts it in 2 different places, it doesn't seem like he's followed what Moshe's told him to do. Sheila Haravi'it, question number 4. Imatorah tzivsa shall v'imiyah. Question 4 I'm going to skip because this is really talking about the brachot and klolot, how they were recited. I'm going to skip that for now. And then we're going to go to question 5, which basically is a question later in the end of chapter 8. It says Yeshua reads all the words of the Torah to all of Am Yisrael. And Barbanel wants to know, in our parsha, it says that the Leviim are the ones who are calling out these brachot and curses, and there's no mention of reading the whole Torah. Radak wants to say the reason Yoshua reads the whole Torah is just like Hakel, but that doesn't work. This happens in Chag HaSukkot, not in the month of Nisan when they're crossing the Jordan. Beit HaMikdash lo b'Hareval, and it happens in the Beit HaMikdash, not at Hareval. So again, why is there this whole concept of reading the whole Torah? Okay, and then he talks about how they were ordained. We're going to skip that question for a minute. Now let's go to some of his answers. Okay. He's going to explain these to try to figure out his understanding of the psukim, which will deal with these issues. Again, he quotes the Gemara in Sota, says that chapter 8 happens at the same time as chapter 4. That the same day that they passed across the Yarden, they went to Hareval and they carried these stones with them. They built this altar, and they plastered them with plaster. After they wrote all the words of the Torah, they then broke apart the Mizbeach. They picked up the stones, and they took them with them back to their encampment at Gilgal. And there they established these stones as a memorial as he explained, as we read in chapter 4. If that is, if we have this, that Chazal understood this because they had an oral tradition, that's exactly the way it happened, that chapter 8 is out of order, then the Kabel Miyam, we have no choice but to accept it. In other words, if there's an accepted tradition that this is how it happened, and that was passed on verbally from generation to generation, together with the book of Yoshua, that this was part of the oral tradition that it happened, Abarbanel says, I have no choice but to accept it if it's part of this oral tradition that was handed down. Aval, but if their whole basis for this is they're trying to coalesce that Yoshua should agree with what's written in Sefer Dvarim, by trying to coordinate what is written in Yoshua with what is written in Sefer Dvarim, they've created 4 problems for me. Okay, by doing that is what he says. Hasavik Harishon. First doubt that I have. Godel haderech v'arko asher holchu bayom hahu yoter mishishim mil. The great distance that they had to cover on that day is a significant problem, he says. V'zebil tiafshar, because the amount that they had to travel is impossible. According to the rules of nature, they could not travel that distance all the way to Hareval and all the way back and have time to do everything in between. The Am Gadol Tafin Hashim Kazeh. If we're telling me, and we said that Yoshua read it to all the men, women, and children, for everybody, with all of the whole camp, to travel all the way from the Jordan to Hareval and back in the same day, impossible. V'chol shekain im yitmamu lasot mizbeach olot shlomim asida maktiva, and to build the altar, to plaster the stones, wait for the plaster to dry, let him write out the whole Torah. According to the rules of nature, it's impossible. Imlo, but he doesn't rule out that it happened that way. Imlo b'neis gadol. If it didn't happen, if it happened, this was a rather miraculous event. These kasav lo zachru b'neis. Why doesn't the verse mention this great miraculous thing that they traveled the whole distance from the Yarden to Eval, had enough time to do this whole ceremony and writing and everything, and enough time to travel back? Yoshua doesn't say anything about it. Which seems to imply that that's not quite the way it happened, because there's no mention in Yoshua of a miraculous, speedy travel from one place to the other. That's number one. Number two, if they took the altar, they built the altar from the stones that were taken from the river, why doesn't the verse say that, well, by the way, when Yeshua built this altar, he built it from those stones that were taken out of the river? All it said in there was that they were whole stones. It doesn't say where they got them from. The verse should have explicitly said, if the reality is that these same stones that they picked out of the river were the ones that were used to build the altar, the Yoshua should have said so explicitly. He doesn't. So that's another problem with this interpretation that Abarbanel says. Savik Hashlishi, the third problem that this creates. The Torah the Navi doesn't say anywhere that, oh, by the way, after they wrote on the stones, they took them all apart and carried them back with them. It doesn't mention that at all. If in reality that's what happened, the Navi should have said it explicitly. these stones, either they're at Hareval as an altar and they're built with everything written on them, or they took them apart and brought them back to Gilgal. But they can't be at both places at the same time. And since the Navi doesn't say anything about them taking them apart and bringing them back to Gilgal, it seems as though these are two different sets of stones. That's what Abarbanel seems to be implying by this doubt. Savik Ravi. Im haya kamat ha'avanim, if this whole ceremony, the establishment of the stones, kodem levinyan mizbeach, before building the altar, kivitzmat Moshe Rabbeinu Shalom, is like Moshe commanded, v'tziva sheyasu kula b'makom echad, and they are all to the altar, and the stones are to be in the same place. Lama basi pu'apom ubilti seder. Then the final question he asked is, if that's really the case, that everything is happening on the same day, why is it written out of completely confusing way and completely out of order? And it mentions here in chapter 8 what happened before the end of chapter 4. And we bring the result, the end result, that they were left in Gilgal at the end of chapter 4. And we all have all these 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7 in between. All of these things that happen in between seem to point to the fact that this didn't all happen on the same day. From here, all this appears that it's virtually seems impossible to reconcile the verses with the words of the Midrash. Now, again, go back to remember that Barbanel started by saying if that was a Kabbalah, that it happened that way, then he'll accept it. But if it's not a Kabbalah, he has all of these problems with the interpretation. Okay. Since Chazal seem to derive this whole interpretation that it all happened on one day from their understanding of our parsha of Ki Tavo, before I can explain you what happened in Yoshua, I have to first understand our parsha. And this is the mitzvah as Vayom Asher Tavru et HaYarden. The words that Moshe says, I have to understand, what does it mean? In other words, notice that first he says, on the day you cross your Yarden, you're supposed to have these huge stones that you're supposed to plaster and write upon them the words of the Torah. And then it says again, then you have a second verse that says when you cross the Yarden, you're going to establish these stones on Hareval and plaster them there. And there you're going to build a mizbeach. And there, and there you're going to write, not only write the words of the Torah, but you're going to write them with lots of interpretations, fully understandable and explainable. And according to the Midrash, by the way, in Gemara Sota, it says Be'er means in all 70 of the written and spoken languages, that all the languages of the world, they had to write the Torah out in one day. So they must have lots of scribes working simultaneously, one in multiple languages simultaneously on these stones, writing all whatever had to be written. Ulefi shamavar farshim davak lishonam el chacham beferush haparsha hazot lo dibru ba karai, because they were stuck with this interpretation. They did not properly understand our parsha. That's why they got into this problem in Yoshua, Barbanel says. In my explanation of Sefer Dvarim, Be'ota Parsha, I've already tried to explain this. But when he's writing this parish on Yoshua, he does not have in front of him his parish on Dvarim. But nonetheless, he's going to go back now and recreate it. Rishona, lama bi'ota parsha tziva moshal inyan avanim shtei pamim. The question that he asks here in Dvarim is, why do we seem to have this story, this mitzvah of the stones repeated twice? because first it says Vayaba Yom Asher Tavru Hayarden. The first time it says on the day you cross the Jordan, and then the second it says when you cross the Jordan you should establish these stones at Hareval. So it question is, are there two different sets of stones? In both places it says they have to be plastered. Twice they're told to write on these stones. It seems very strange that if it's all referring to the same mitzvah, why is this all repeated twice? Abarbanel asks. If we go back to our parsha, we see the whole thing is written twice. Twice it tells us about stones, building them, plastering them, and writing on them. Why does it have to be there twice? Shenit Tidar Lama Pamar Yishana Amar Vayaba Yom Asher Tavruat Hayardem Vashni Amar Vayab Avrachem V'lo Amar Sheyeva Yom Hahu. The problem, Aronel says, if this is the same thing, why the first mitzvah time it repeats the mitzvah, it says, but on the day you cross the Jordan. The second one says, it says after you've crossed the Jordan. So are these really talking about one and the same thing or not? That's what Abarbanel seems to be leading to. Okay? A third question he asks on our parsha. In the first one, it uses the active, you shall establish. The second, it uses the passive. The stones should be established rather than you should establish. Also uses the word lecha for yourself as opposed to takimu, they should be established. So again, the question is it for you or is it for future generations? Revi'it, fourth question. The first time, it doesn't say where they're supposed to be established. It just says you should have stones when you get across the river. Second time, it says, no, you have to establish some kind of stones at Hareval. Also, there's the first command, the first two psukim in our parsha, which commanded the first time, doesn't mention anything about building an altar or bringing offerings, and the second time it does. Okay, so again, lots of questions. Again, pretty much they're all in the same vein. Again, all sorts of different wordings that are used. If they're referring to the same thing, it should say the same thing. And why do I need it twice? Which is basically his question. Now, Abarbanel is going to explain, I think the following is the case. There seems to be a well-established custom, Abarbanel says, among all of the nations of the earth. Shekol am o melech she'elech lichvosh eretz acheret. Any king or nation whose goal is to conquer another land, miyad kishiyavor eleha yakim avanim gedolot zul malam izul etziyun v'siman she'avrushamo v'lachloto. Immediately when they cross the border and invade the land, they build a monument of large stones stacked one upon the other as a monument to say, we've been here, we've conquered it. We're here. We've conquered this stretch of territory. And they would not only build a pillar of stones, they would write on these stones. Shebishnat kach v'kach, basham hamelech hagadol ploni, im ha'am ploni, lichbosh et haaretz hazot. And they would say, in such and such a year, such and such a king came to such and such a place and conquered such and such a land, and he conquered this land, and that's why he's building this monument. Hine, and he says, Abarbanel, Abarbanel's writing in the 15th, 16th centuries, he's writing this. Italia, remember, Abarbanel grew up in Spain, ultimately made his way through the Middle East, got to Italy, not through the Mediterranean, not through the Middle East, through the Mediterranean to Italy, and he's been to lots of places in Italy and Spain. Kol makom asher dorchu bo raglei haromaim bizman gedulatam umalatam timtaot hayom tziyunim rabim asu hakadmonim b'zerach haderach. He says, if you pass through Italy and you pass through Spain, you'll see all of the places that the Romans conquered when they reached the height of their emperor. you'll find today these pillars still exist in this fashion. Such and such a pillar written with here, the Romans conquered here, the Romans got to here. Or even if you think about in terms of England, Hadrian's Wall that still exists today, marking the extent of the conquest. Ubechol makom asher sham ir kulish hanak hagadol bone harim amdinot asa kadavar zeh. And again, every place where this thing happens, where you have these huge monuments, they build, that's where they build cities, and everybody seems to apply this concept. So what does Abarbanel say? Since Am Yisrael was destined after the death of Moshe to enter Eretz Yisrael and conquer it, Amar Aleichem Moshe Adonenu. Moshe, our master, says to them as follows. Hinei na yadati. I know, Moshe says to Am Yisrael, Shatem bayom asher tavur hayardain, on the day you cross the Jordan River, tirtzu lakim avodim, you're going to want to establish a stone monument, vlasido tam besid, and to plaster it so it'll stay for a long time. Vihu anikra balaz, whatever it's called in this old whatever language he's speaking, yashau, gips meaning plaster. Sheyasimu alo avanim lachin otam lichkabel hapituach laktiva. This plaster has to be put because if you write on stones, it won't last. But if you put plaster on the stones and you write on the plaster, the writing will survive. That's how writing was done in the ancient world. That's what Abarbanel is saying. So Moshe is telling the people, you are going to enter Eretz Yisrael. You're going to cross the Jordan. You're going to want to build a pillar, a monument to mark your entry into Eretz Yisrael and your conquest thereof. The Omer Ani Yadati Shetirtzu Lakim Avanim. I, Moshe, know you're going to want to memorialize that. V'tirtzu Lichtov Aleihem, and you're going to want to write it. Kol Divrei HaTorah Zot Yavrecha. You're going to want to write the words of the Torah, not the Torah. When Moshe says the words of the Torah, he means the words of the teaching of what is it that we want people to know when we build a monument, who the king who conquered it was, what time it was that the conquest happened, what the conquest was. That's what Moshe is referring to. He wants to write your whole history of who you are and how you got here to conquer this land. Ratzalomar, what he means to say is not writing the words of our Torah, but he wants them to write the whole story of how they got to this conquest. Ratzalomar, what he wants to say, Sha'el hotziatchem b'Mitzrayim, v'vietchem 40 shana b'midbar, shavartem et hayardem, v'yavashtem et mastem la'aretz. All the miracles that Hashem took you out of Mitzrayim. He sustained you for 40 years in the desert. You crossed the Yarden on dry land, and now you've entered Eretz Yisrael. That's what Moshe is saying that he should write on the stones at the crossing. He calls them Divrei HaTorah Nichlal B'Amro B'Avrecha. That's what Moshe means, that you should write on these stones about how you crossed the Jordan. And those all of your history as to how you got to this point. Since you're going to do this on your own, this is something that every nation does when it begins to conquer a territory. It is not, I want you to make it not to Hashem. That's why he warned them. That now, after they've done these stones on the Jordan, they now have to go to honor Hashem by taking stones on Har Eval, and there they have to build a Mizbeach. Not only about how they crossed, Kigam called Divrei Torah of mitzvot. There on Har Eval, as a memorial to Hashem about the crossing, that's where they have to write the whole Torah with all the mitzvot. And that Moshe writes on the day that they cross, Ein zeh mitzvah. This is not Moshe referring to a specific mitzvah. Aval hu sipur ha'atid. This is telling them what's going to happen. Ve'ola al rucham, and what they are going to choose to want to do. Sheyirtu lasot us. Because on the day they cross, they are going to want to build a monument to Hashem. Maybe it's to Hashem, but that's not what Moshe's commanded. He said, when you cross over, you'll build the stones in that place. V'lachein lo amar takimu b'lashon tzivoy. That's why the first time it doesn't say takimu, you have to establish. Kim v'kemot, you will choose to do it. It is telling them what will happen. So the first two psukim are relating to one event. Am Yisrael is going to cross the Jordan. They are going to want on their own volition to build a monument. But on the monument, Moshe is telling them they're going to want to write their whole history of how they left Egypt and how they got to this point. Eina mitzvat haktiva. Writing these words, that's not the same as writing the words of our Torah that they are supposed to do on Harei Val. Avol yagid shacharei sheyakimu avonim yirtzu gam lichtov aleim kol divrei v'yonei Torah. Lo me'amitzvot ki im yameneha havara. The stones that they're going to write on when they cross, they're going to write their history on. That's like every king does when he conquers a new territory. And that's why there, in referring to those, it says, Bi avrecha, when you cross over. But talomar b'inyanei havaratcha, about the story of your passing over. That's what's going to be written on the first set of stones that are going to be established when they cross, the day they cross, that's going to happen. And that's what happens in chapter 4, in Perek Dalet. The Amar Moshe Rabbeinu Olav Hashalom sheyasu lefi sheyeda be'emet kim yavo la'aretz asher Hashem notein lohem kasher diber v'az yirtzu lasot zeh. And Moshe is simply telling them that when they cross the Yarden, that yes, you are going to cross the Yarden. It's not going to happen like it happened with Meraglim, that you're not going to get into Eretz Yisrael. You are going to cross, and when you cross, you're going to want to do this. That's what Moshe is telling them. But v'acharei shehiktim kol zeh. But after he's now told them, this is what you're going to do the day you cross, now he gets to the commandment part. And that is all of the things that are going to happen in Harei Val. After you've already crossed the Jordan, you have to now, just like you built a monument to talk about your history, now you have to make a memorial, an eternal memorial to Hashem. That even when you do this, you have to do it to honor Hashem, not for your own honor. Normally the kings do it to say, see how great a king I am. Moshe is telling Am Yisrael, when you do it, you have to do it to honor Hashem, not to honor yourself. Not immediately when you cross over. Aval kasher yavruat hayarden. Later, after you've already crossed Jordan, not on the same day that you cross. You will now establish a similar set of stones at Harei Val. This is the mitzvah that Moshe is commanding them. These stones that you wanted to build for yourself to show how great you are, build them to honor Hashem. Well, Hashem mitzvah, and as a mitzvah, the place Hashem will select. Not in any other place or for any other purpose. And that's why the second time around it says, you have to establish these stones. That even though I'm commanding, Moshe's commanding them this before they cross, those stones are to be Baharei Val. And then again, you have to plaster them. And that's. I realize my time is up. I'm going to stop here. But I thought Abarbanel was very interesting in telling us that we go all the way back to our parsha. This Vayom Asher Tavru et Hayarden is Moshe telling Am Yisrael what is going to happen, and Vayabi Avrachem, and which does happen in chapter 4 in Yoshua. The rest of this chapter in Dvarim of Chav Zayin, from verse 4 onwards, is Moshe telling them what they have to do when they get to Hareval, after they've already marched into Eretz Yisrael and gotten to Hareval. Then they have to do this whole ceremony, and that's what we read about in Yoshua Perek Chet, that they go through this whole ceremony of building the Mizbeach, putting plaster on, writing all the words of the Torah, and going through the whole ceremony of the Brachot and Klalot as we read in this week's parsha. And I think the whole point of this whole parak that we're talking about is, again, that wherever we go, wherever we are as Am Yisrael, we always have to remember that the only reason we own Eretz Yisrael, our only claim to Eretz Yisrael, is not because we conquered it under Yoshua, not because the UN said we could have it, not because of any wars we fought, but because Hashem has given us this land, and we forget that at our own risk, that Hashem has given us this land. It's a conditional gift that we have to live by the rules of the Torah, set up a society that is geared to promoting the values of the Torah and teaching the world about Hashem, the Creator, and through that, we are fulfilling the mission of the Jewish people to create an awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu amongst humanity. And when we're able to do that, we will have successfully accomplished our mission, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be, Hashem will be recognized by all of the world. That will be the day that true peace will arrive, and thank you all. I apologize that I went so long. I hope you gained something out of this, and want to wish everybody a good rest of the week. A Shabbat Shalom. But before I do that, I have to open up the questions, comments, or feedback. Anyone before I close up? Okay. No questions, no comments. Okay. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the week. Laila Tov, Shavua Tov, and we'll see you.